Now, we like to call it the real why because, as David Ogilvy, our founder, once said about people, well, they don't tell you what they think and they don't do what they say. And, he was kind of right. And that's why a lot of research can be horribly flawed. But behavioral economics and behavioral science goes a long way to helping us understand a bit why people act the way they do, why they make the choices they do. And I'm not going to retread that ground of all the experts that you have today because we see the real why as a species wide phenomenon. This is the heuristic biases we all use, the cognitive heuristics we all use, the cognitive biases that we get tripped up by. But I'm going to take you down another path. And that is the layer below that human species level of the individuals. How are we wired as individuals to make sense of things, to make decisions? And this is what we call the hidden who. So let's embark, and we've got 3 new lenses that you can use to bring individuals into a sharper focus. Because again, while behavioral economics tells us quite a bit, it doesn't tell us about how individual reactions change depending on how each of us is wired. And this is a whole new approach. I partnered for more than 3 years with John Poulston at Kantar. It's now picked up a basket of awards, and you can use this in an integrated approach to better decoding individuals. Sometimes they're humans. So these are the 3 ways we do it. First is personality. Personality trait science. Now, this is not like Myers-Briggs, which is not a science, though widely used in companies. Personality trait science is pretty robust. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of studies across most markets on the planet. Here's an article you could pick up in Harvard Business Review I co-authored with Sandra Matz on how you might be able to use and deploy ethically personality-based marketing. How does it work? Well, the simplest approach is the big 5 ocean construct, called OCEAN for the acronym of OCEAN, as you see here. Now, the first one is openness to experience. It's not like transparency, it's openness to variety, to experience, to trying new things. Now, each of these is a spectrum. You could be lower, middle, or high on each one of them, and together they create a kind of fingerprint for your personality. Most scholars think that these are fairly well baked in by the time you're in your mid-20s, and they're about 50% hereditable. So if you look at each of these, they tell you a lot about you individually, but together even more. Openness to experience. At one end, you could be very traditional, not very open to fantasy and the arts, a sort of Vlad, if you will. Or you could be at the very high end, a Richard Branson, up for any kind of experience, including space. Conscientiousness at the low end, you're probably more of a Ricky Gervais, and a high end, you're more of a Hermione Granger. Extroversion at the low end, you'd be more introverted, and that's more like a Bill Gates versus that extreme high end of a Joey Tribbiani from Friends. Agreeableness at the low end, pretty Larry David. At the high end, it's more of a, wow, Jennifer Aniston. Agreeableness at the low end can be cynical, acerbic, skeptical. Sometimes people might even think you're a bit of an. And at the high end, you're really warm and engaging and pretty trusting. In fact, you may even be gullible. And then comes neuroticism, often called emotional stability, because we don't want to anger anybody if they're pegging the needle on being neurotic. So putting all these things together becomes really important because there's a huge body of literature, and a growing one in health and other domains, about the correlations between personality trait profiles and how people behave, how they make decisions. If you take this into account when you're trying to change that individual's behavior, it might just boost your effectiveness. Now, the second lens we use is a kind of worldview. It's cultural cognition. This has evolved from the grid group cultural theory model by Dan Kahan at the Cultural Cognition Project at Yale University in the US. And it looks a bit like this. Each one of us can be mapped to this. There's an instrument we can administer and find out where you sit. Now, at the top are people who are more comfortable with a very hierarchical construct in life. They like a strong boss, a strong, clear leader, and a clear pecking order below them. At the bottom, their opposites are completely flat, egalitarian. Hey, who died and made you the boss? You're not the boss. And on the horizontal axis on the left are individualists. These folks really believe in accountability, and all outcomes are based on what you do, not on the societal constructs, not on safety nets or anything like that. On the far right, communitarians really believe that it is all about community first. Now, where you see the confluence of these forces, you begin to have portraits that begin to flesh themselves out. So on the upper left, the hierarchical individualist is all about free markets, a business and competitive approach to the world, but also on the social side, fairly traditional. And their opposites, for example, in the bottom right, these communitarian egalitarians are completely about social progress, close every gap, inequality gaps of all kind, gender bias, pay gaps, LGBTQ bias, close these, make it fair. And they are very pro-regulation because they believe the markets that the folks in the upper left believe in really can exploit and make the poor poorer. So they don't really get along very easily on the diagonals on this graph, and they don't change very easily. And if you can decode people, you can be much more effective in actually changing their behavior. Look at how this manifests itself in a place like the US. Just look at it through, say, pop culture. 2 TV shows, both shows very popular, Modern Family, very inclusive, warm, multi-generational, and Duck Dynasty, swamp dwellers who have invented a bird call. Very, very different. If you look at the heat maps of where these shows are well viewed and loved in the United States, where you see the darker area is where they are viewed and loved. And if you look at them side by side, they're almost negative images of each other. This is but one way this cultural cognition, this worldview manifests itself. But it also, for Americans, you would know this, there's what's called the Cracker Barrel Whole Foods split. Now, you can see this on maps like this, but it also has huge ramifications and it's being tracked in politics. For example, the Cracker Barrel Whole Foods split has been getting ever larger with every election in the United States. So this cultural cognition can be a very powerful thing, and you can even use it to decode employees or your sales force, as we've done in one case. For example, if you look at the difference between very junior people in the same sales force, and you notice that they're split largely between the three areas on the left and bottom right in terms of their worldviews. But when you get to the very highest level of sales in a company, you can see an interesting thing happens, that they get completely polarized between the bottom right and the upper left. And these are not complementary views. This has huge implications for managing this sales force. Dan Kahan, who came up with this whole framework called cultural cognition, has something he calls the disentanglement principle. He says, don't make reasoning-free people choose between knowing what's known and being who they are. In other words, much of his experimentation, his studies have shown that really smart, very literate, even scientifically literate people will choose their identity over the evidence you show them. So if you threaten their identity, it doesn't matter how clear your communications, it doesn't matter how smart the audience, they are going to give you a surprisingly negative reaction. The third one is called cognitive styles. Now, this is really a basket of ways we are wired to make decisions. Here are just a few of them. Locus of control is really this sense of where is the control in your life? Is it outside of you? Is it external, meaning it's chance or fate or maybe your genes? Or is it internal, like those people in the individualist sector who say, I am what I do, I make my own outcomes. This is really important when you're trying to change behavior. If you know somebody is extremely external locus of control, giving them just the information to say lose weight or quit smoking, that's not going to work. They need a lot more support and help, since they believe that the change comes from the outside and not from themselves. So that's an important thing to know. The second is regulatory focus, and there's even a health regulatory focus. And this is that both a state and a trait. People can be temporarily or as a default more towards a promotion mindset or a prevention mindset. And it makes a very big difference. A promotion mindset are those who feel it's worth going for it, a little bit more risk perhaps to go for a goal, to go for achievement, whereas the prevention mindset is all about risk mitigation, harm mitigation. Don't do anything that might cause a loss. And so when tests have been made about communications, there's some evidence that a gain frame works better with promotion mindset and a loss frame works better with prevention mindset. So good to know if you can decode people. You get down to the bottom left and how people make sense of what you're giving them in communications. They may be wired to be high need for cognition or high need for affect. They're not mutually exclusive, but tend to go different ways. Somebody high need for cognition really wants more evidence. They're not satisfied right away when you tell them something. They want to probe a bit, ask you lots of questions. They like thinking. Those are high need for affect are far more persuaded by an emotional narrative, especially a visual emotional narrative. And finally, the Zimbardo time perspective tells us a lot about whether you are more wired to be past oriented, nostalgic, it could be positive or negative, present, very hedonic possibly, or future minded. Now, when you're talking to somebody about taking care of themselves, for example, say getting a vaccine, it matters a lot whether they're completely locked in the present or whether they're future minded, or even if they're going to save for retirement. The present minded person, it's more difficult to move them because they don't really process the future consequences of what they do today. So if you think about, for example, the spread of a disease like COVID, somebody very present-minded is not going to be thinking about the exponential contagion from a month from now. So these are huge principles that have been there. We have started to integrate them as lenses and had terrific success with boosting effectiveness of communications using them. For example, working to communicate climate change risk, or with vaccine hesitancy, where we can decode why people who do vaccinate their children versus those who hesitate to vaccinate their children, how might they be wired differently? It's not just about the information and the education, or even in the behavioral science of smoking cessation. We've been able to predict without ever asking somebody whether they're a smoker. With about 85% using a personality study, we can predict whether they are or not. The next one is imagine you are a doctor and you've just diagnosed a patient who needs insulin because they're diabetic. Well, did you know about half of people who should be taking insulin don't? It's called psychological insulin resistance. So what we could do is build a simple app that would give the doctor, in a very quick survey of the patient, much more about that patient in terms of how they're wired, and therefore how the doctor might frame the need to take insulin. For example, this health locus of control, internal versus external, just one of the parts of the app. We can also find motivations for people, whether they're employees or a sales force. Virtue signaling, for example, something that Jeffrey Miller, who you'll hear from later, is very famous for studying. So there is a challenge with self-report methodology. We've all seen it, whether they're convenience samples or the traditional personality self-reports. And I think we all know what it is. What if you gave this guy a self-report survey? How do you think it's going to come back? Maybe not the most self-aware. And so what my colleague John Poulston and the Kantar folks have done is reinvent some of the methodology used in the traditional approaches to things like personality to mitigate this impression management and self-report bias. They do it through competitive choice. They do it through using visualizations, things that are very quick and don't force people to think about it very much. And last, I want to talk a little bit about how pandemics affect our behavior, and just one really important aspect, because you'll hear lots of pronouncements about all this will change. nothing will change. Um, Here's something we do know from past pandemics, terrorism attacks, things that scare populations. It divides us, and it can divide us along those tribes that I showed you earlier in cultural cognition. But here's why, in part. It's called mortality salience. And that's basically when you remind a population about their own eventual demise. You make their own death more salient. Some interesting things happen to people. They become more extreme versions of their prior selves. And that can get quite ugly and quite tribal. In individualist cultures like the US and the UK, it can mean much more nationalist, much less caring about people on the other side of the planet. If you can look at the cultural cognition map, you can begin to see the effects of pandemic on that, in that the individualists are very much about getting back and opening up, whereas the communitarians are much more worried about those who are vulnerable. So it also has an interesting effect on consumers. If you dig into the literature, you'll find that mortality salience sometimes lead to increased consumption, especially amongst people with low self-esteem. And it can really skew towards luxury good items, something to keep your eye on, and something that's been happening over in China as they come out, for example. And it can also make people very jingoistic, anti-foreign brands. And so with that, I'd like to thank you. And as we go forward through today, keep your eyes open for the real why and the hidden who.